Welcome to the third session in the Adaptation Planning and Practices course. So today we will discuss step 3, which is all about challenges and opportunities. My name is Patricia Leopold. It's great to meet you all. I'm a climate adaptation specialist with NIAX, and I spend most of my time coordinating forest adaptation work across the Central Appalachians region and also the Mid-Atlantic region. I've co-taught a number of these adaptation courses with Courtney and Danielle and a lot of the other folks on this team. And I'm excited to be with you for part of today's lecture. Courtney Peterson will be co-teaching today's lecture, and I will let her introduce herself.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone, and afternoon for some folks. I'm Courtney Peterson. As Patricia said, I also work at NIAX and will be helping out with today's session as well. And I've seen a lot of you in the Tuesday discussion session already, so good to see you all again.
And I've also seen Danielle, Kristen, and Anna Marie on today's session. So we'll all be helping each other address questions in the chat box or comments or sharing resources. So if you need to say anything during the lecture, go ahead and use that chat box. And today's lecture will also be one of the shorter lectures of the course, and so we should have some time at the end of today's lecture to do any troubleshooting if you need that. In terms of what we will cover today, we will cover the basics of step 3 and also outline the assignment and homework for this week. So step 3 is pretty straightforward. If you need to take a break from the heavy lifting of step 2 in order to catch up or explore some additional resources, then this is the week to do that. You might even feel like reading ahead to step 4, looking at the recreation adaptation menu or thinking about what are those potential adaptation actions you might pull in from the adaptation menu. So feel free to do that. And of course, before next week, we want you to finish your step 3 and then also your homework after the step 3. And so just a PSA, if you are not seeing that step 3 homework or any of the homework, then your project is not yet linked up with the recreation course. Please email one of your instructors if you're not seeing the homework, and we can correct that for you so that you start seeing the homework and also the other resources that are provided in this course. So this week we are going to introduce step 3, which is all about evaluating management objectives given climate change. In step 1, you identified your management goals and objectives, your location and your time frames. And then last week in step 2, we identified the climate change impacts that are most likely to affect your particular project site and everything that's going on there. So now this week in step 3, we're bringing those two ideas together to think about how those site level impacts will affect our ability to meet our management goals and objectives. So we planted this seed last week that sometimes step 3 feels a lot like step 2 because they both consider climate change impacts, but they do it in different ways. Step 2 focuses on how climate change affects our site or our place, and step 3 focuses on how climate change affects our goals and objectives. So we'll take a closer look at this. Step 2 is really about how climate change affects the place where you are working and what are those site characteristics that make it more or less vulnerable to climate change. So do you have dry soils or wet soils? Are you on a hill or in a valley? What are those characteristics that make it more or less vulnerable? And then in step 3, we begin evaluating how climate change will affect our management goals and objectives under current management. In essence, can we do what we set out to do given the additional stresses put on our site location by climate change? Step 3 is really bringing it all together to describe how climate change is affecting your whole project and what you're trying to do there. So once you complete this step, you will then be able to move on to the next step, which is about identifying adaptation actions that address these challenges and opportunities. So you can't know what to do about climate change until you have this full understanding about what are your challenges and opportunities. So the key questions that we ask in step 3 are: what management challenges or opportunities might occur because of climate change? Can our current management meet our management goals? Or do we need to change those goals or those more specific objectives in order to be more successful at meeting them in the long term? So again, step 3 provides the opportunity to reevaluate our project and whether it still makes sense overall under climate change. So next, I'll walk us through the different elements that you need to fill out in step 3 as part of the Adaptation Workbook. And in this step, you'll weigh those challenges and opportunities that climate change presents, and you'll also determine the feasibility of meeting your management objectives under climate change. So it's kind of a 2-part step. It's still really easy, but just two little steps. So the first thing you'll do in step 3 is to identify climate-related challenges to meeting your management objectives. So in this step, we will list the ways in which climate change impacts or vulnerabilities might make it more difficult to achieve each management objective. And this course is about climate adaptation planning. And so here we just really want you to focus on just the climate related challenges, not all of the other challenges that I know are a part of our projects, like funding, staffing, markets, policies. There's a ton of challenges to management, conservation, land stewardship. But here in this step, we are hyper focused on how does climate change make it harder for me to do my job? How does climate change make it harder for me to do my job? So here are some example objectives from past projects along with challenges to those objectives. And today I'm just going to focus on the example on the bottom for the most part. So let's say that we have a management objective that is focused on maintaining an existing trail system and developing several new walking trails around a public park. So in step 2, we identified that this park is really susceptible to increases in precipitation because of its position adjacent to a river, sited in a floodplain. So now in step 3, we can think about how that extreme precipitation affects our management objective. And we can say with confidence that new damage from erosion caused by this precipitation and also an increase in hazard tree removal is going to make it much harder to maintain those walking trails. We're just going to see a lot more debris and a lot more erosion. So it's really decreasing our ability to maintain those walking trails, which was our goal. So again, just note that we're really focused on the climate change impacts here, and we want to really focus on how that management objective will be affected. And so once you've listed your challenges for a specific objective, you'll then begin listing any opportunities that climate change might create for achieving your management objectives. So here we'll focus on the ways in which climate change impacts and vulnerabilities will actually make it easier to achieve each new management objective, or even create new management opportunities for you. And so for our opportunities, we again want to just focus on those ecological or environmental challenges that are related to climate change. So sticking with the same example, an opportunity from climate change might focus on the late season trail conditions. So if we're anticipating more rain and damage in the spring, then we might also anticipate that the trails will dry out earlier in the summer, and together with a longer growing season, we could actually see a longer recreation season. So that's, really an opportunity here. So for each management objective, it's useful to think about how climate change might make it easier for us to achieve our goals. And then in the next step, in step number 4, we can identify adaptation actions to take advantage of these opportunities. And, just a teaser, often the opportunities then will point to potential adaptation actions, but that's really the next step. But you can always write those down when you think of them. So if you have any ideas about what actions might be needed to help to adapt to changing conditions, take a note so that you have them ready for step number 4, or you can even jump ahead. But here we're just thinking about the opportunities, what would make it easier on you to meet your management goals and objectives. So in that way, we're really documenting a full set of challenges and a full set of opportunities. We're thinking about everything, every aspect of what it would take to meet our management goals and objectives, and how climate change will affect that operationally, biologically, etc. And we can start to see more clearly how climate change will affect our individual objectives and our overall project. And we can begin to evaluate if the odds are really stacked against us or not. So we think about all of our management objectives, and we catalog the challenges that climate change presents, and then we catalog the opportunities that climate change presents, and we can start to see if there's more challenges than opportunities, or maybe there's more opportunities than challenges, or maybe they're about equal. And that balance is really telling us the feasibility of being able to meet each management objective. So in this part of step 3, you'll be evaluating the feasibility of achieving your objectives given the challenges and opportunities that you've identified using your current management. So really just your business as usual, the current management tricks and tools that you already have in your toolkit, without considering adaptation. So feasibility can be determined for individual or multiple time frames. So you can think about, feasibility in the short term, which might be a little higher usually than feasibility over the long term. And then you'll just simply rate your feasibility as high, moderate, or low. And so high feasibility usually means that existing management options can be used to overcome the challenges for meeting management objectives under climate change, and the opportunities are more likely to outweigh the challenges. Then low obviously means that existing management options might not be sufficient to overcome challenges to meeting management objectives under climate change. And then moderate is somewhere in the middle. There might be some challenges, but you can probably overcome them by using existing management options or by pulling in, you know, some reasonable amount of additional resources. So it's really that easy. Don't overthink this, but just think about each objective and really use it as a gut check that you should be able to assess pretty quickly. With all of your usual management tricks and tools, can you still meet that management objective, or is it requiring a lot of new resources or inputs? And so for this example, continuing on, the park managers rated their feasibility as low here. And they did that because although they may have an overall longer recreation season, the substantially greater costs of trail maintenance and more time spent repairing the trail system is going to decrease the amount of time that those trails are open and functional. And so they have low confidence that they can consistently meet that management objective without pouring a ton more resources into it that are going to be expensive and time consuming. So the way that they have written this objective is written with low feasibility, just because of the climate change impacts that are anticipated on this site. And so step 3 also provides a checkpoint to slow down and consider whether you are going to continue with your objectives as written, or if you need to adjust them to better reflect the realities of what you're seeing at your site. So if you're finding that you have a management objective with low feasibility, this is a good time to consider whether you want to continue with that objective, or if you want to go back and change it to be more in line with your expectations. So if your feasibility is high, then you can probably identify some adaptation actions in step number 4 that can help address your challenges or take advantage of your opportunities. But if your feasibility is low, then you might want to think a little harder about what your options are. So there's a couple of ways in the workbook that you can address low feasibility. And the first option is to adjust your management objective. So maybe in this example, we want to rethink our overall objective about maintaining all the existing trails. Maybe we just want to maintain fewer existing trails and put more resources into areas that don't get washed out so frequently. So in that way, we can kind of just rewrite our management objective into something that is more achievable. And so if you're rewriting your management objective, what you want to do is go back to step 1 in the Adaptation Workbook and rewrite that management objective to reflect that idea to maintain the best trails that are most protected from hazards and erosion. So you can make a note in that objective that you did in fact change this objective from your original intent, and that's really just a placeholder for you and anyone you want to communicate this plan with, that you had this other idea, but climate change actually impacted it so much that you had to go back to the drawing table before you even finished the adaptation planning for it. So it's a good idea just to note that and reflect that level of thought that went into it. And so once you change your management objective in step number 1, then you can come back to step number 3. One of the really cool features of the workbook is that all of your edits will automatically update step 2 and step 3 if you revise them in step number 1. So now that you're back in step number 3, you might simply need to adjust your feasibility if need be, since you rewrote your objective. So now I mentioned that there are 2 ways to address low feasibility. The other option then is to stick with your management objective as it is written, moving it onward to step number 4 and counting on there being some adaptation strategies that you can implement to help you out. I don't want to jump ahead too much, but maybe in the next step, you would identify some ways to reroute some of the worst parts of the trail in order to reduce maintenance costs over the long term. So that would be an adaptation strategy on your existing management objective. So either because you can't change your objectives for some reason, or because you see ways to adapt already, then your second option would be to keep your low feasibility objectives and move on to step number 4. And finally, there's also a spot for other considerations in step 3. So this is where you can list any of those social, financial, or other factors that also affect your decision to pursue your management objectives. So this is where you would detail why you will continue with an objective, even though the feasibility may be low. Like maybe it's a threatened or endangered species that you're required to manage for, even if it has low feasibility. Or maybe you have an existing funding source that would be a good source of funds for this project. This is where you can note that kind of information. Or maybe your conservation partners have a tree planter or other equipment that they can loan you in order to complete this objective. So this space is just wide open for anything relevant to your project. And this is where you can put all of those considerations that aren't specifically related to climate change impacts. And so here you can see that some of the types of information that are included as other considerations can be about timing. So in the first example, thinking about how, minimizing hazards requires a super fast response time, which could be logistically difficult for your organization. Or it could be that, your project area is known for a certain type of recreation use and the public is counting on that, for example, as a bird watching site, or that funding or a change in policy might be needed to complete this objective. So there's just tons of different ways you could fill that out, and it just reflects what you care about and identify as important to your project. So those are all the items that go into step number 3. In summary, there are a few helpful tips that we can go back to. So first of all, the challenges and opportunities are related to climate change, and then those other management challenges or opportunities that you want to record that aren't related to climate change, those all go under the other considerations column or box in the workbook. Secondly, there's a difference between step 2 and 3 that we just want to point out. So we don't want you to feel like you have to restate all of your climate change impacts all over again. Instead, we want you to hone in on how those impacts really affect your ability to do your job every day. So that's, think about step 2 focusing on the site, and then step 3 is really focusing on how to get that objective done. And then finally, the opportunities can often bleed into adaptation strategies. So we just want you to be aware of that as you're thinking about them, and go ahead and write those down for the next step, or even jump ahead and start filling out step number 4. So next, Courtney is going to show us an adaptation demonstration project. And so while I stop sharing my screen and she queues up her screen, we can take a few minutes for questions.
Did you email us a link to all the previously recorded weeks?
Yeah, the weekly newsletter that I believe is sent out by Danielle often contain the links to the slides themselves, also the recorded lectures, and then lots of additional resources or information. So if you're not getting those newsletters, check your spam folder. It's coming from nyax.org. And if you're still not finding them, just send us an email and we'll double check and make sure that you're getting those newsletters, and we can resend you that latest newsletter. Great question. Okay, Courtney, go ahead and take it away, and then we'll have time for more questions after Courtney's presentation.
Sounds great. Thanks, Patricia. All right, hopefully you can all see my screen and hear me okay. Perfect. All right, so now what I'm going to do, as Patricia said, is dive into an adaptation example for the Lytle Creek project, which is in the San Bernardino National Forest in California. And so this project, if you end up reading through the paper that goes into detail about the recreation menu, this is one of the examples highlighted in that paper. And so that's just another good reference to check out. And then you can also find that link at the bottom of this slide that links to more details about this project at our Climate Change Resource Center as well. And so this project was created through a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service Region 5, the California Climate Hub, and the San Bernardino National Forest through a series of workshops that Kristen helped lead in California for thinking about climate adaptation on the San Bernardino National Forest. And so some of the management goals identified by the Lytle Creek team included things like providing high quality, safe recreational facilities for people who are coming to the forest, directing visitor use away from some of the more sensitive areas, maintaining and improving riparian health within the watershed, and then also improving stream connectivity and function in Lytle Creek. And so using those goals as kind of the foundation for the project, they also identified a series of climate change impacts, just like you all did last week in step 2. And so some of the key climate change impacts identified for Lytle Creek included things like changing precipitation patterns, which are affecting the bog, especially as there are drier summer conditions. So they're not seeing as much precipitation that they're used to in the summer. Also, some of that precipitation is coming in really heavy rain events, which are causing flooding and interacting with nearby farms, causing nutrient runoff and into Lytle Creek. There's also shifting plant distribution patterns occurring, which are interacting with already low prairie diversity in the area. And then there's the potential for exacerbated invasive species and pests as well. And so thinking about all of those impacts and the management goals and objectives, Lytle Creek identified some of their key challenges and opportunities. And so again, this is what you'll be working on this week for your step 3. So for example, one of the challenges is with increasing temperatures. With more hot days, there's the potential for more visitors to Lytle Creek. And so there's an increased demand for water and shade as we're experiencing more of these warmer temperatures, particularly in the summer. And so Lytle Creek is a great destination since it's got the creek, there's water recreation opportunities, and there's that shade. There's also an increase in the recreation season, which is creating challenges. So there's going to be that increased use to the area, and however, there might also be an opportunity where that increased visitation leads to potential increased revenue to the forest as well. There's also a challenge with more drought. So this could be changing some of the stream flow patterns, which could also alter some of those opportunities for recreation to the creek and affect some of the aquatic species that are found there as well. And then those extreme precipitation events and wildfire could be leading to infrastructure damage and causing challenges when it comes to visitor safety. And then one additional opportunity that was identified is that there is native vegetation that's already adapted to some of these periodic flooding and fire events. And so as we're seeing more of those, that native vegetation might be able to withstand and adapt to some of those conditions. So that was one of the identified opportunities. And so considering those challenges and opportunities, and the feasibility was rated as moderate or medium, because maybe some of the opportunities might outweigh some of the challenges, but some of those challenges are going to be really challenging to deal with, especially with that increased demand for water and recreation in the area. And so this is a list of several recreation adaptation approaches that were identified by the Lytle Creek team. And so I'm just going to highlight a couple of these, but these are pulled from the recreation menu. And so again, with that increased visitor impact, one of the approaches chosen was to really reduce visitor impacts to some of those vulnerable areas. And so the specific adaptation tactics that were identified by the team to really reduce some of those the impacts to those vulnerable areas included things like developing designated parking spaces, or maybe new parking or recreation areas to help disperse visitor use to Lytle Creek, to add a few shade structures at picnic areas to help disperse picnicking outside of the riparian corridor, and to consider potential seasonal shuttle services that can work through the canyon. So those are just a couple of examples, and then you can see some of the other examples of adaptation approaches, such as relocating existing infrastructure and opportunities to areas with less risk of climate exacerbated damage. So some of the different options for that were creating maybe artificial water features at the Lytle Creek Ranger Station, such as a wading pool or splash pads with solar powered pumps, to really continue to provide some of those water recreation opportunities in the creek with some of these changing conditions and increased impacts. And then, of course, wrapping it up with monitoring, some of the things identified that the Lytle Creek team wants to continue to monitor into the future are things like the water quality, is there vegetation gain or loss in the riparian area, and especially in those heavy use areas? Are there changes in the number of visitors versus the impacts that the visitors are causing? And then what is the number of user created dams, and what is overall visitor enjoyment as some of these adaptation actions are implemented to the area? So that's just another example of a recreation project that has worked through this adaptation planning and practices process, and some of those challenges and opportunities that they considered as a part of their project at Lytle Creek. And so before we go into some tips and tricks about using the adaptation workbook this week and what comes next, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions.
With the last slide that you had up, the measures, how those don't look super detailed, like, water quality. Is that okay to not, qualify that?
So when we get to the step 5, we'll go into a little bit more detail about 3 different kind of steps to consider when you're putting together your list for monitoring action. So really, what's the criteria you're evaluating? How are you going to evaluate if it's successful? And then what is your plan for actually implementing that monitoring process? And so including a few more of those details for your projects will be really helpful. Since we're not to that point yet, I just kept the monitoring slide for this pretty vague. Good question, though. Any other questions? Cool. All right, so just some tips for this week. Again, when you're in the adaptation workbook, you're going to want to list your challenges and opportunities related to each of your management objectives. And so what you'll see is the opportunity to add a challenge or an opportunity and add a new text box for each. And what you'll want to do is make sure you add a new box for each challenge or each opportunity instead of listing them all within one box. And then if you need to reconsider your objectives because again, you're really the feasibility of your objectives under those climate change challenges is really low. And so as Patricia said, you want to go back and reconsider some of your management objectives. You can jump back to step 1 and the adaptation workbook will then save the changes you make to those goals and objectives as long as you have a good internet connection. And so as a reminder, you can always write down these steps in a Word document or an Excel file so that you can copy and paste them into the adaptation workbook as well and save your information in a second place just in case you have a poor internet connection. And so this is what it'll look like within the adaptation workbook. And so you'll see those little boxes where you can go in and add a management challenge or a climate change challenge for your management objectives or add those opportunities and then go in and rate your feasibility. So you under business as usual or current management, how would you rate your feasibility of achieving your management goals and objectives? And then give a quick explanation as to why you're rating your feasibility that way. And then there's, of course, that other consideration section where you can go in and add a few of those additional considerations, whether it's political constraints or financial constraints or capacity and that sort of thing. So for next time, what you'll want to do is finish any remaining items you still have from step 2 and then complete step 3, which is again evaluating your management objectives, and then complete the homework that follows step 3 as well. And then if you have not had a chance to check in with any of us as your facilitators and instructors, please do so. Hopefully you've received an email from at least one of us at this point. And then if you would like to work ahead, there is a video on adaptation strategies and approaches, which will be really helpful for really thinking about step 4 as we start diving into those adaptation strategies, approaches, and tactics. And then we do have a discussion session this week on Tuesday and Wednesday. And so for this week's discussion, you'll want to be ready to start to talk about your site's climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. And then there is going to be another optional session. And so this is coming up next Tuesday, April 27th. And so we'll be taking a deeper dive into the recreation adaptation menu and a few of the other different menus of strategies and approaches offered by NIACS. And so this is a great opportunity to learn how those menus are developed and all of the different topics that the adaptation menus cover so that you can decide which one is the right fit for you and your project. And maybe you'll want to pick some adaptation strategies and approaches from a few of the different menus and not just the recreation menu. So it's a really helpful session that I would encourage you to attend if you can. And then looking ahead again by next Monday, the lecture will cover, again, those adaptation strategies and approaches, and that's step 4. But before then, for the discussion sessions this week, coming up on Tuesday and Wednesday, be prepared to describe your climate change vulnerabilities, and then also start thinking a little bit about those challenges and opportunities to your management objectives so that we can have a discussion about that as well. And so we'll really dive into what are your top 5 climate impacts and some good examples of how your site conditions are really affecting the vulnerability ratings that you've given to your projects based on step 2. And if there's time, we'll talk about the feasibility of meeting your management goals and objectives over the next 20 to 50 years. And so that is it for this week. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions.